have anything they don't have.
Where did you have there?
Uh, yeah, down in New Haven, yeah. And so, and the Yale Forest and the Harvard Forest have been, quasi competitors and rivals ever since. Yeah, right, exactly. So, hi. Hi, nice to meet you. Great to meet you.
Glad you're coming in.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks. Oh, great. I work with, just was texting her that she's not able to make it to the forest tomorrow. Can I introduce tomorrow's speaker? Yeah, so, yeah, she's great. Yeah. You're a decision analysis guy? That's what somebody just told me. Did I get that right? Okay. Nice. Do you do climate stuff? I'm sorry, I don't know. I probably should, but yeah.
You know what I do? I look, at the Farrington Memorial which is up in Fairfax,
Mm.
and their mission is to bring conservation values to the forest towards healing. And yeah, I talked to the owner and the so we were talking about on the right hand turn of the barn walking in paved roads. Paved roads is a great way of walking in. And so what I was thinking about, one of the fixes is why don't bring like kids out to nature, out to the forest.
Yeah. Thousands per year. It's like every field trip in Massachusetts goes to the Harvard Forest. Yeah.
And you give them tours.
Absolutely, yep. We have a whole education outreach department that focuses on that. And we have, um, yeah, we also are in, I think now, 120 schools with our schoolyard ecology program. We do this sort of train the trainer model where we teach them and then they collect data in their own schoolyards and then we host it on our website and the schools can compare their tree data to the other tree data and watch when the leaves change. It's very cool.
So I'm interested in the psychology overall
Oh.
in what brings joy in nature. And one of the royal rose and
Yeah, we bring them up in the towers, and that's always the winner. We have you can see the towers in that picture, and they climb up to the top and see all that far. It's amazing. That is awe for you right there. Yeah.
I was skipping rope about a year ago, as you did this big red spot was nice. Going out once and running on top of the aspen
Yeah.
so as a psychologist, you study observation,
Yeah, I've heard a bit about that. Yeah.
which is basically getting people, and it's getting more common. Actually, in Vermont, where people will be out there listening. They can put in the name meditating on exactly the forest bathing out there,
Yeah.
and as the traffic increases, pollution goes up.
Right.
How did you hear about this group?
This guy.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tom, that's it.
Yeah.
Jim. Well, we're glad to have you.
I'm ready when you are.
Maybe we should get going.
Yeah.
You've got your mic.
Yeah. What was the woman's name who's helping us with the IT?
Sarah.
I just want to make sure. Sarah? Sarah? I'm going to interrupt here. I'm sorry. Can you confirm that this is working for the Zoom? Okay. Thank you. I think she said it was working or she's checking. I just wanted to make sure this was going to work out and that I didn't need to
Now? Better? Hello?
Check, check.
Test, test. Better? Hold it in my mouth? Okay. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of Metro West Climate Solutions and First Parish Lincoln. Metro West Climate Solutions is a organization that was founded in 2019 to promote sustainable communities and to give talks in support of that goal. It's made up of First Parish Lincoln, First Parish Weston, First Parish Wayland, First Parish Framingham, what else? Sustainable Weston Action Group, Sea Free Lincoln. Have I forgotten anyone? Energize Wayland. I think that's the whole list. We give talks. We've been giving talks and presentations since 2019. You can find them on the website. I think almost all of them are there. Usually they're on Zoom. This time we decided to give a hybrid talk, both in person and through Zoom. And we're really happy tonight to have Jonathan Thompson from the Harvard Forest here. Jonathan is the research director at the Harvard Forest. Harvard Forest, if you don't know it, is a 4,000-acre research facility that's part of Harvard University. It's a long-term ecological research site for Harvard that's sponsored by the National Science Foundation. There's a lot of great work going on as part of that. I think the website says there are 100 researchers involved in those ongoing studies out there. And Jonathan's lab is intimately involved in that, I think running that program essentially. Jonathan is here tonight to talk about what climate change is going to do to our forests and how forests fit into Massachusetts' program for mitigating and adapting to climate change in the coming decades. Jonathan has all the degrees you'd expect of somebody working for Harvard, so I won't bore you with a recitation of that. I know he wouldn't want to hear it again, and you probably don't either. So rather than talk more about qualifications or studies, I'll let him talk about what he's doing out there. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to use this mic for the folks who are online and assume that my general loudness is just good enough for the room. That's going to work? All right, fantastic. So today I'm mostly going to talk about the landscape ecology research that I do that looks at either the New England scale or the Massachusetts scale. But I did want to give just a quick plug for all the work we do at the forest, which is very site-based, very boots on the ground style ecology. How many of you have been to the Harvard Forest? Oh, I don't even need, you could give this talk. So it's just down Route 2, takes 57 minutes to get there. That's how long it took me to get here anyway. And to me, it's really one of the most magical places in Massachusetts. I've been going there since I was a child. I actually did all my graduate work in Oregon, but came back to be a postdoc at the Harvard Forest. Then I left and worked at the Smithsonian for a bit, and then came back about 10 years ago into my current role. We call ourselves Harvard University's Outdoor Laboratory and Classroom, and you can see some pictures of that here. This is the world's longest running soil warming experiment, where we've been trying to understand how climate change will affect below ground ecosystems. They are much more difficult to study than the above ground have, and we've learned quite a lot from that. Here you can see Andrew and Megan on one of, I bet, half dozen or so towers that are scattered throughout the forest, measuring off influxes of carbon between the atmosphere and the biosphere. Every summer we are lucky to host 25 or 30 undergraduates from around the country in the Research Experience for Undergraduates program. You can see some of our students there taking soil respiration. We have this 35 hectare, 70 or 80-acre plot where we measure every single tree that's bigger than your pinky every 5 years. That's about 175,000 trees that we keep very close track of and what's happening to them. Up there, that's Linda Mate. She's a journalist. She wrote an entire book about the Harvard forest through the perspective of one oak tree that she happens to be spending the night in up in that picture there. That book's called The Witness Tree, and it's a fabulous book to learn about New England ecology, the Harvard forest, and climate change. So that's sort of my plug for the forest. We got about 50 miles of trails that you can come walk on, a beautiful museum, and I argue it's the most studied forest in the world. Intro, it's going to be hard. You can't hear me online, is that? I mean, no one has ever called me quiet. We'll try it. I moved it up. But I'm not really going to talk much more about the Harvard forest unless you ask me questions about it. What they asked me to talk about today was the role of Massachusetts forests in climate policy. And so I'll be going back and forth a lot between New England and Massachusetts just to sort of put what's happening in Massachusetts in context, and because a lot of the work I do happens to be at the New England scale. So I know some things about that. But I wanted to start with this. This is a figure that is part of the Massachusetts Decarbonization Roadmap, and Massachusetts has legislatively committed itself. I guess you can see all of that. I don't know. So these are the building sector, the transportation sector, the electrical sector, and how we are going to reduce emissions to meet the net zero commitment by 2050. But removing all emissions is incredibly hard. And so at the time, Governor Baker was the one who was running this when it came through. I ran the land sector analysis. They decided that up to 15% of emissions could be offset through carbon removals from the atmosphere, right? And there's many technologies coming online to do carbon removals from the atmosphere, but none of them are quite scalable or efficient. And for the time being, trees are really the best technology we have for removing carbon from the atmosphere. So the way the policy states is that 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions needs to come from emissions reduction, but 15% can be met to meet the net zero through carbon removals, largely through forests. So they picked that number without talking to me or apparently anybody else about what was possible in terms of how much carbon the forest could remove. And so I've spent some time working on that. Though I want to say today, I'm not presenting the work for the state. I'm just presenting my own work. And if you want to get mad at somebody, get mad at me. This is not the state's work. There will be a report coming out in a couple months that talks about this, but it's not quite ready, so I'm just going to present my own work, not the state's work. So that's been disclosed for the lawyers, right? So let's talk about how we might get to 15%. It's an interesting place to do forest research, New England anyway, in so much as it's among the most forested parts of North America and the most populated. One of my mentors, Dave Kittredge, always used to say New England's a place with trees in the overstory and people in the understory, and to understand either one of them, you got to understand the other. And you can also see that New England is this connection between the temperate forest and the boreal forest. It's a really important point as the climate changes, and there needs to be northward migration of trees and animals, that New England plays a really important role in sort of continental scale connectivity of forest ecosystems, right? And so if you've ever seen me or anyone else from the Harvard forest give a talk, you've probably seen this graph. It's a really important figure. It shows the decline in forest cover associated with European colonization, and then the subsequent regrowth and re-expansion of the forest up until about 1990 or so, when we the curves changed again. So I showed this figure 1,000 times, I don't know. And I hadn't really thought much about how unintentionally me and everybody else were giving the impression that this was the beginning of time. And this was the beginning of relationship between people and forests in New England. I didn't mean that, but that was clearly the take-home message. And so I'm trying to do a bit better job of acknowledging the plain truth that this has been a peopled landscape for 10,000 years. In central Massachusetts, where the Harvard Forest is, it's the ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc tribe. And we are increasingly working with the Nipmuc both to incorporate their traditional ecological knowledge and information about their land use practices on the land, and acknowledging that they're not some historical relic, but they're still a community, and that they'll be part of these forests into the future as well. And so there's a lot of land back movement happening around the Harvard Forest that we're part of, and it's been an interesting part for the conservation community to come around, and how conservation easements have obstacles, and here we thought they were the way to go, and that the tribes are having trouble with it. So a woman who I work closely with, Clarice Hart, is leading up that effort, working with Cheryl Hawley and Nia Hawley, who is the chief of the Nipmuc, trying to give them the tools to be able to bring land back in. Currently they have a 3.5-acre reservation, and that is it. And so we're trying to help them remedy that. That doesn't, in my mind, change the importance of this figure, because the legacy of European colonization is written all over the forest. Nobody ever built a stone wall in the woods, yet everywhere I look in the woods there are stone walls. And that's because they were built here, right? This is a period that not far from here, Thoreau was writing Walden and talking about how we'll have forests no more, that the North American continent would be cleared of all its trees. It was a little less true in the northern states. We'll give it a whirl. All right. So this is all right. We'll make it work. Hopefully they can hear online as well. I'm sorry to those of you online. So this crowd probably knows better than most the history behind this figure and the story of European colonization, and then at around the midpoint of the 19th century, the Erie Canal opens up. There becomes bigger economies in the city. People realize there are just less rocks if you go towards the Midwest, and now we can move our food around a little easier on barges and trains. And so all this area gets abandoned, and forest, it's not like we replanted it. This wasn't some great conservation plan that came by. This is just dumb luck in the resilience of our landscape, that if you stop mowing your lawn, you get a forest. And indeed, that's what happened for about 150 years of this tremendous second chance. And here in around some point in the 1980s or 90s, net forest expansion is offset by deforestation, and now all 6 New England states are losing forests again. So I think that this is kind of a qualitative figure that David Foster made that goes along with it, but I think it really drives home the point about that landscape. Like, Thoreau never saw a deer. He heard that Emerson's aunt saw one once, though, which to me is just like really like knocks it home. Like, this was a totally different landscape back then, right? And you can see the return of deer. And now, in all these prairie obligate species, bobolink and meadowlarks being dominant, that now everyone's trying to do conservation to try to conserve those, even though they weren't a really common species before the colonization. So, okay, that's what I want to say about the return of forest cover. I also want this to advance, but it doesn't want to. And so let's talk a little bit about forest composition and the change in forest composition. This guy is Charlie Cogbill. He is one part ecologist, one part historian, one part crazy man. He spent most of his career in the basements of town halls throughout New England, reading the early proprietary records from when the landscape was divided up into private holdings. His work is really the only way we know what the forest species composition was before European colonization. Through his career, he, looking at these records, and here's an example of one, you can see at this property boundary there was a sugar maple, and here there was a maple and a chestnut, and this is just one example of the type of records he would use until he had actually collected 338,000 individual tree mentions within New England. And then he went looking for a quantitative guy and found me, and so then we analyzed those data, the difference between the pre-colonial, so this is what we believe the forests were composed of before European colonization, and this is from the Forest Service FIA database. So this is a modern inventory of our forest. So there's a few things that pop out to me when I look at it. The first is, boy, there's a lot of maple in the modern compared to the pre-colonial period. And I'll tell you, while I only know the genus on the pre-colonial, we know the species in the modern data, and this is just overwhelmingly red maple. Red maple is like the raccoon of tree species. It's just a generalist. It does very well in human-modified habitats. It's okay if it's a little sunny, a little shady, a little wet, a little dry. It's a very generalist species, and that's what we've seen really come back since the reforestation. The other thing I notice is there's a lot less beech. And so beech is an old growth, shade tolerant species that's associated with very old forest, at least when it's large. It's also, as a quick aside, the peer reviewers of our paper didn't like the beech because they assumed, this is a very civilized crowd, you would never carve your name in a tree in the woods, but maybe when you were a small child you did. And if you did, I almost guarantee you did it on a beech tree, because the bark of a beech tree just, it's asking for it. It's like a piece of paper that you could scroll on. And my peer reviewers believed that the prevalence of beech in the witness tree data reflected the fact that surveyors would disproportionately use beech to mark. And maybe they're right. This wasn't like a scientific sample, but it's the only thing we got, so we're gonna stick with it. So we've lost our late successional species. We've also lost a lot of the oak, right? And not only have we lost the oak, this sort of spatial clumpiness that existed in the pre-colonial is just gone in the modern data, right? It sort of looks smeared over. And this just reflects the fact that the system hasn't had time to settle out. I think if we disappeared and we took our bugs with us, or all our insects with us, this forest would move back to this condition except for the chestnut. That's the only species that was present in the colonial data that isn't present as a large tree in the modern data. Of course, now we have insects going after about all of our tree species. We're slowly losing hemlock to hemlock woolly adelgid. Ash is pretty much gone now, and as of 2 years ago, we have beech leaf disease. I had not heard of beech leaf disease 3 years ago, and now every beech tree at the Harvard Forest is infected with this nematode and is expected to be regionally extinct. Yes? Yeah, they weren't a dominant species in the forest. They're sort of an open land species, and they just didn't rise to the numbers. Mostly people are familiar with elm because they were planted so much. So I kind of take two things from this as a whole. One is sort of, oh wow, this has changed a lot and the forests are totally different. And the other one is just the other side of the coin. Wow, if you were to pick up some Nipmuc person and put them in a time machine and push them forward 400 years, they'd recognize all the trees. That the forests have largely come back with with a similar composition, different relative contribution, but the native species came back. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion, and again, it speaks to the resilience of these forests. So we talked about forest extent, we talked about forest composition, so let's talk about forest growth. I assume, that people are comfortable with the idea that trees take up carbon, right? That's fundamentally what's going on in photosynthesis. That's why forests are part of the decarbonization roadmap. But what kind of knocks me out is that I work with the smartest scientists, forest scientists around, and this here is a graph of cumulative carbon accumulation in a hardwood forest at the Harvard Forest starting in 1992, and there it goes up and up and up, and I can't tell you when it's gonna stop. I know it's gonna. I know it's not a redwood forest. I know that eventually that this line, it would bounce around zero and you would get a dynamic equilibrium, that is the process. But I don't know when that will happen in New England forest. I don't know when it would happen if left to sort of natural processes, and I don't know when it'll happen under the new climate that's going on. So this is a major open question in ecology. When Steve Wofsy, who's a professor in Harvard Earth and Planetary Sciences, built this tower, nobody had built anything like it, except in agriculture. Every version of it that existed was like knee high, and he built one above the canopy of the forest, 6 times a second. It's measuring the exchange of carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere, and there is now 60% more carbon in that forest than there was when he built the tower. And he thought it was already at equilibrium because that's what everybody thought. So that was news, please. So we have a tower called an eddy flux tower in the forest that's measuring the rate of either carbon absorption by the forest or carbon release by the forest many times per second, 6 times per second. And so, you're not telling me not. Okay, I was like, uh-oh, what am I doing wrong? And so in the case of this, what it's saying is when the line slopes down, carbon is leaving the forest and going into the atmosphere. When the line slopes up, carbon is moving into the forest, and this is just cumulative, so it keeps going up and up over time. It has the little sawtooth on it because it's a hardwood forest, and the leaves come off, and the leaves come on, and the leaves come off, and so you're seeing the seasons each year. So it's basically the difference between the carbon concentrations above the canopy versus in the canopy, and they measure it at multiple elevations all on that. They actually use eddies in the wind and the covariance of it. It's totally fascinating, and the fact that it works knocks me out. Like it really shouldn't work as well as it does. And like I said, this was the very first one. It's still standing. We're rebuilding it this fall for the first time, but there's now 1,700 of these in what's called the Ameriflex network around the world. For many years, all our knowledge about carbon flux came from the Harvard Forest. You'd see a map of the US, but it was all based off that one data point. Now there are many, many more. Yeah. Oh, yep. Sorry. Okay. The question is, do carbon fluxes in individual trees, what's the difference between carbon fluxes in individual trees and forest? It sort of scales, right? Like you got 1,000 trees in the forest, it's about 1,000 times as important as the one in the yard. The one in the yard tends to grow faster because if it's a single tree, it's getting light from all sides and lots more resources. It's not competing. You know, in a forest, the most limiting resource is light. It's the only reason trees are tall and wood is solid, is so they can kill their neighbors. And so any individual tree is probably not as productive at sequestering carbon as one tree in a forest, but you know, sort of by definition, there's lots of trees in the forest, and so in the end, forests matter a lot more than individual trees in yards, and particularly street trees, which tend to die very young. They're sort of rock stars. They grow fast and die young. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one control of that, oh, sorry, is there a control, like a tower that is in a non-forested environment? So yes, the towers are used in agricultural fields, in lawns. I mean, but they get very small because they need to just be higher than the vegetation stature. But one way to think about it is every night there is an example of where photosynthesis isn't happening and the tower is running. And at that point, you're just getting the respiration of the trees and the carbon going back. Like, let's say there's 100 units of carbon that get fixed in photosynthesis. 70 units would be respired by the plant itself. 15 would go into leaves and seeds and reproductive tissues, and 15% would go into wood. And so we've gotten really, particularly at the Harvard Forest, probably more than anywhere else in the world, really good at sort of parsing the carbon budget in a forest to understand where it's going. The land sector in particular, from the perspective of climate, is the only sector that the arrows go in both directions. You know, transportation just emits, houses just emit. The land sector is unique in that they both emit, and they emit them, you know, in old growth. When a tree dies and it decomposes, that's just photosynthesis in reverse. That carbon moves back into the atmosphere as CO2, and so we're constantly measuring it in both directions. I love all your questions, though I have no idea how I'm going to get through this by 7:40, which is 6 minutes from now, and I'm on my third slide or something. I love the questions. It's really my favorite part, so I'm sorry. I'll try to, well, we'll see. I want to show, so then we built a couple other towers in time. So then the fact that this starts here only reflects the fact that we built it in 2005. So all of they start at 0 at the time we build the tower. This one we built in a hemlock forest. That's why it doesn't go up and down. There's no sawtooths because the leaves aren't coming on and off the way they were in the hardwood forest, right? But at first when we built it, the hemlocks were healthy. And the hemlocks grow at about the same rate as the hardwoods do. Until about here, when the hemlock woolly adelgid really got established. That's a little aphid-like insect that is from Japan and is slowly killing off the hemlock. It's already killed all the hemlock in the southeast, and it's always been limited by cold temperatures, and we used to be the northern extent of it, but now cold temperatures don't come as much as they used to, and so the adelgid has moved all the way up to Ontario now. This is an old graph, and I'm sorry, I even tried today to update it, I just didn't pull it off. But what I can tell you, because I've seen the data, is that this stand continues down, but then starts pumping back up again. And what that represents is not the recovery of the hemlock, but the establishment of black birch in the understory. And the black birch is now sequestering carbon, and you know, the Eddy Flux Tower doesn't care who sequesters the carbon, it's a whole ecosystem measure. And so now that's recovering there, even as we lose the hemlock, which is a sad story. The hemlock, unlike chestnut, which was functionally replaced by oak without, like ecologically, they're sort of redundant. There's nothing like a hemlock. And the things that a hemlock does in a forest are not replaced by black birch. And so that's a much bigger ecological transformation than was the loss of chestnut. This here is just another testament, I keep pushing this, of resilience of New England forests. We built this tower in a clear cut, and we put it there the day after the trees left on the truck, and we measured it, and at first, the site was just a source to the atmosphere. This was the decomposition of all those roots that were in the soil and all the slash that was on the ground and the warming of the soil, which juiced all the microbes to emit more carbon. But that only lasted about 5 years before the pin tray really established, became a nightmare to walk through, but started sequestering carbon, and within 9 years the site had recovered back to where it was at the time of the clear cut. And at that point we took it down, but I could assure you that those trees are much larger and that line would keep going up had we left the tower there. I like this next slide, but I'm going to skip it because we're running out of time, and I'm going to do that a few times, sorry. So where do we stand? This beginning of the talk for me was sort of trying to say, like, what's the status? And first I want to show you this figure, which shows sort of the unique value of carbon storage in Massachusetts. So you look at the Maine landscape, which there is much more forest in Maine. Half of New England is Maine just by land area. But the density of carbon per unit area is just a fraction of what it is in southern New England. That reflects both the climate and the soils, but mostly the harvesting practices over the past century in Maine compared to particularly western Massachusetts, which in New England is the biggest storehouse of carbon. I want to remind everybody the difference between carbon stocks or stores. That's just the amount of wood on the site. If you were to take a tree, dry it out in an oven, you would find that it's about 50% carbon. Ranges in species from like 47 to 53, but so do you. If I dry you out in an oven, you're about 50% carbon. And so we just use that as a rule of thumb for the amount of carbon in the forest. So those are the stocks. Our forests in Massachusetts are just under 60%. And sitting in that forest, this doesn't speak to sequestration. The state's policy is all about sequestration. It doesn't really think about the stocks, and I'm kind of worried about that because nobody gets anything out of the stocks. They're just sitting there until they don't. And then all of a sudden they can turn it around and emit. So within the stocks, in our forest is the equivalent of our past 15 years of fossil fuel emissions, which is a big responsibility. Let's put it that way. We are stewards of this. A lot of people want to talk about sequestration. It's super important. I'll talk a lot about it today. But maintaining and stewarding the stocks is at least as important. How do you get that much stocks? Lots of sequestration. That's all it is. It's just accumulated sequestration. But our trees are like 125 years old on average, so they represent 125 years worth of sequestration. So I want to emphasize that protecting the stocks is at least as important as trying to manage for sequestration. Right? Okay. So a few takeaways of this first section is that forest expansion has peaked. We had a long period where we were getting more forest, but that has turned around. Native tree species dominate, but the relative abundance of those species is wildly different. The forests contain massive stores of carbon in the trees and in the soils. It's about 50-50, carbon above ground and carbon below ground. But the 50% above ground is much more dynamic. It's actually fairly hard to move the carbon that's below ground, right? Unless you like bulldoze it up and move it around. But even forestry, which you'd think, oh, all those tractors moving around, all the meta-analyses say that's fine, particularly if you do it in the winter and you can really mitigate losses below ground. So we really worry about the above ground more than we worry about the below ground, at least in the short term. But worth noting, 50-50, above and below ground. And we'll say that the forests are still growing and sequestering carbon. And this slide, until today, which I've given this slide before, said, and no end in sight. But I've been watching data from the towers this past year, and now I'm going to say that it's uncertain. Our trees seem to think they're in a drought even in their wettest years. And that's because we are not having the winter snowpack that melts slowly in the spring and slowly offers water to the tree in the spring. And when we are getting rain in these wettest years we've ever had, it's coming down so fast that it's moving off laterally. And the trees are not experiencing it as the wettest years ever, even when our rain gauge tells us it's the wettest year ever. And that's causing a really high amount of variation in annual growth that we hadn't seen in the first 35 years of that tower. We've had years, like we were like an average of 2 and we'd kind of bounce around 2. We've never had a year that we were a source to the atmosphere, but we've gotten very close. And we've also had years where we put away 4 tons. It's just really flickering. And like in systems analyses, you don't like flickering. It seems to portend a state change. And so that just has me worried, so I changed it. So what's the dominant driver of change in modern land use? This was all sort of historical. It's not climate change, despite what I just said. It's still land use. That's the major driver of change in New England forest. And as a guy who studies it, and who used to study it in Oregon, I can tell you it's hard to do it here. In Oregon, Judge Dwyer signs an opinion that says the spotted owl needs to be threatened, and he shuts down logging on 12 million acres of forest with the one sign of the pen. Here we have 600,000 landowners in New England, 200,000 in Massachusetts. And this is what Odom called the tyranny of small decisions. You know, they are making their decisions for perfectly valid reasons. I don't want to undermine the decisions they made, but they're making decisions about what to do with their forests based on college tuition payments or a divorce or a death in the family, and trying to manage across 200,000 landowners who are making decisions like that is really, it's a unique challenge and it's a difficult thing to follow. I used to study fire when I was in Oregon, and I study it like this stochastic random process. And some of my success here has been treating people like fire regimes. Like they have central tendencies, but they have huge variation as well. And so you need to really treat people like they are wildfires. So if land use is the most important determinant of future forest condition, it's worth asking how do they use their land. These are sort of the 3 most actionable things they do. It leaves out maybe the most important thing they do. I told you that most of our trees were between 100 and 125 years old. The only way that happens is if they do nothing a lot. And so that's maybe the most important thing landowners do. But as far as like the things we can measure and think about, we think about harvesting, protection, and conversion. I'm going to try to move a little quicker because I'm running out of time. I'm supposed to be done right now, and I'm not. So I want to talk about forestry. I want to first say that I'm a forester. I want to say that forestry does emit carbon. It does, and this is a complicated decision. I think wood is often a good choice, and that there are a lot of great things about forestry, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact. And I find this argument just people want to be on one side or the other, and that just doesn't work. First thing is that as we talk about how much forestry happens on the land, nobody is talking about consumption. So I wanted to start with this line. So in New England as a whole, forest production is about 75% of forest consumption. So we use more than we grow and harvest in New England, but it's not terrible, right? But we have Maine to thank for that, who grow way more than they use. Massachusetts produces 7% of what it consumes. And so as we think about forestry, unless we think about changing consumption patterns, you need to think about where that harvest is going to come from. The atmosphere does not care. It does not care if the trees were harvested here, Maine, not Singapore. Anyway, it does not matter where the trees were harvested. You know, that said, let's talk a little bit about forestry and harvesting in New England. You can see really big variation throughout New England. About 4% of Maine's forest is subject to some type of harvesting every year. We're just about 1.5% in southern New England. Folks who don't do forestry might just think clear cutting is what we're talking about. There's almost no clear cutting left in New England, even in Maine. The average percent basal area is just a measure of how much wood is on a site, is 43%, right? And just 15% in your average harvest is removed in New England. That's because we high grade a lot of the trees. That's because it's not typically a forester. It's typically a logger who comes in and says, I'll give you 20K for access to your back 40, and they just take out the choice material. This is not a recipe for a healthy forest. But overall, if we think about commercial harvesting in Massachusetts, it occurs on about 17,000 acres per year, and that has declined over time, and that doesn't surprise me. What surprises me more is that it's declined a little over time. Throughout the 70s and 80s, that number was between 20 and 25,000 acres. So it has gone down, but not as much as I would have guessed as Massachusetts becomes less of a natural resource-based economy over time. I already told you that it meets just 7% of our consumption. It has a pickling rate of less than 10% after 30 years. What's a pickling rate? It's exactly what you think it is. I love the word. I try to find opportunities to do it. But a lot of times forestry advocates, I am one of them, speak to the potential to store carbon in long-lived wood products, right? And that potential exists. But if I were to ask you what you thought the proportion of the harvested wood that is pickled for more than 30 years, I would have picked a number greater than 10%. And if you went to a Doug fir forest, you'd be right, you could pick a number bigger than 10%. But here, first of all, hardwood trees aren't as amenable to boards as are Douglas fir trees, which grow straight up for 200 feet. And much of what gets killed just gets wasted or moved into short-lived products. The biggest area we store wood is landfills, which to me is just a depressing statistic. So this doesn't mean that when you harvest it, 90% of it the next day is in the atmosphere. This is 90% of it by 30 years after the harvest is in the atmosphere. That's a depressing number, and a number that I think there are many opportunities for us to improve our wood utilization. To me, that's just waste. I mean, we'll never even get it to 50%, but you could do a hell of a lot better than 10. And it emits, I meant to say something in the beginning that I forgot to, but it emits about 500,000 metric tons of CO2 per year, and that's a number that is hard to get your head around. I wanted to show you in the beginning that 1990 level emissions that all of the climate policy is based on happen to be about 100 million metric tons, and then all of a sudden it's much easier when you know that to think about what a half of one is equivalent to, and we knew we could get 15% from forests, and so that forestry is a half of one gives you some idea of where forestry sits in the scheme of potential. Okay. So takeaways from harvesting, I'd say there are many, many opportunities for good forestry and local wood. I want to know who the marketing people around the agriculture are who got us all to be hepped up about local food. I love that. I just wish we could be equally enthusiastic about local wood. I have never seen 2x4s at the farmer's market though. But there's really no reason for that. There are a lot of, I think, opportunities to make local wood more interesting. I think industrial forestry is a bit like industrial agriculture to the extent we think that organic local farming is all lovely. I think there are many opportunities to think of forestry the same way when you get up to investment firms owning, huge tracts in Maine, the practices aren't quite so quaint. Harvesting is a major source of land sector emissions. That said, if we don't deal with consumption, we're either going to shut this down and build with steel and concrete, which is going to be much worse than wood, or we're going to harvest somewhere else, which is going to be the same exact problem. So, I'm always in this pickle because I'm quantifying the emissions associated with forestry, and they're real and they're significant. But that, in a relative terms, in a system dynamics perspective, it's better than a lot of alternatives, and unless we deal with the consumption angle, there's really, I don't think, a better alternative. So that's what the leakage problem is, where we shut it down here and we just leak it out of state. So conversion. Yeah. Okay, All 6 states are now again losing forests. It's about 10,000 acres a year in New England, with about half of that happening in Massachusetts to buildings. I'm going to skip that number. Increasingly, forest loss is coming from solar development as well. I wrote this report with Mass Audubon last year where we looked at the future of solar in Massachusetts. Massachusetts EA has set a goal of 27 gigawatts of electricity. In order to decarbonize the economy, we need to produce a lot of clean energy. And right now, solar is one of the fastest growing ways that we're meeting that. I happen to love solar, but here's another sort of difficult situation. We lost 10,000 acres in a decade, which is, makes it about 10% in the last decade. But this is nothing compared to what we'll have to do to meet that 27 gigawatt. That's my dog Rooster. I like to give him a cameo. If we meet the 27 gigawatt mark and we do it with the same sort of lack of planning that we've done the growth so far, this simulation, can you see the yellow? Okay, so you'd end up with 100,000 acres by 2050 to meet the 27 gigawatt goal using current practices. It doesn't have to be that way. That's what the Audubon report shows, is how you reach 27 gigawatts without doing this and how you can lose a lot more. It's a shame to me how this has really divided the environmental community around me when I drive to work. I don't know if you guys have it, but it's like solar and forest, we need both, signs in the lawn, a lot of people really angry about it. What we showed is that for a comparatively small cost, we can meet the 27 gigawatt goal on roofs, on road medians, on landfills, on golf courses, on people with really big backyards. And yeah, we used people with really big backyards in it, and that we got a lot of pushback. Like, that's kind of audacious. I think it's audacious to cut down a 150-year-old forest to make it more than somebody's backyard. But that's my own opinion. The last thing I want to say about forest loss is it's not just about the forest loss. What we've learned recently in a series of analyses is that the forest on the 20 meters or like 60 feet from a non-forest edge is a completely different forest than the interior forest. The amount of invasive species, the way it cycles carbon, the way it cycles nitrogen, the way it cycles water, it's an entirely different forest. It's kind of crazy that we've never measured it. Ecologists all like to be deep in the woods, and I think all we've ever studied is deep in the woods, and it's only recently we've been studying on the edge. Then I hear, 20 meters next to an edge is totally different. I think, well, that's not very much forest. Why are we going to get excited about that? But it turns out about a quarter of our forests are within 60 feet of a non-forest edge. And if you look in places like Boston, 83% of the forests in Boston are within 20 meters. But in my fair town of Petersham, the red is the edge forest. It's just about 9%. So it really varies. But I just want to emphasize that the problem is not just the forest loss, but it's the way the forest loss leaks into the interior forest as well. So what do you want me to do, Tom? I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry. Keep going. You guys good? Okay. I hate to be disrespectful of people's time, but if you're into it, we'll keep going. So the forest loss is different than forest harvesting because you lose both the stocks, what leaves right there, but you also lose all future sequestration potential. That's the one big difference with forestry. You do lose the stocks, but you don't lose the sequestration potential, and in many cases you can increase the sequestration because the forests are younger and they get more light, and you can increase the growth in forestry. Forest loss, no such luck, right? Renewable energy is increasingly a driver of forest loss. To meet that 27 gigawatt goal, forest loss to solar will dwarf forest loss to buildings. And it's going to happen in entirely new ways. We've all gotten sort of familiar, if not happy, with the sprawl frontier and the way we lose forests as we move away from cities. The forest loss for solar is just happening where land's cheapest and where you can interconnect into the grid. And so it's just wildly different patterns in what used to be our largest intact, remember that really deep red section of carbon-rich forest? That's where solar's going. And so it's really kind of upset the apple cart as far as what we know about patterns of forest loss. And so here now, forest loss in Mass emits about half a million metric tons per year. That's about the same number we saw from forestry, right? This is only slightly more. That one will go up more with solar if we continue doing it the way we've been doing it. Okay, last I'll talk a little bit about land protection, and then we'll wrap up with how we tie it all together. That to me is a great map. It's an impressive map. I feel good about it. It's 25% or so of all of New England in land protection. New Hampshire wins that battle, but they're cheating. They have the White Mountain National Forest, and I just don't think they should get credit for that because they're actually doing much more slow land protection outside of those federal forests. But Massachusetts is doing good down here at 29% or 30% now that's protected. These labels are really small, I'm sorry. This is state land. The hashed mark is the proportion of protected land that was protected before 1990, and above the hash is what's been protected since 1990. So you can see state and municipal lands are the majority of our protected lands in the state by a lot. And easements, while not as much as those two, are bigger in the new area. This is the way much of the private land is getting protected now under easements. Worth noting is the wildland proportion. Just 2.3% of the state is in what you'd call a wildland designation. So what does that mean? Wildlands are either protected in fee but have a management plan that says there will be no resource extraction. All of the rest of these protection types allow harvesting and resource extraction. It just prevents development or parcelization. Usually when we say protected, implicitly we're meaning it's protected from development. While that's important for carbon, we saw that that's only half the story for carbon. If all we cared about was protecting carbon within our borders, I hope that's not all we care about, but if that is all we cared about, then we would want to target our land protection towards both of those land use threats. And we just don't have a lot of wildlands. It's about 7% of the protected land and about 2.3% of the land itself that's protected. A third of everything protected in Massachusetts has been protected since 1990. So this is my riskiest slide as far as like nerding out into some deep stats. I don't even know if I should do it or not, but what I want to prove, don't do it, go for it. Okay, so what I'm really into this school of statistics called causal inference. In ecology, my whole life, everybody was like, correlation does not equal causation, and then we focused on correlation as if we didn't care what caused things. It's crazy. But then I started working with economists. Economists do causal inference. And so with this study, what we did was sort of fake a randomized controlled study, right? And what do I mean by that? Think of like a drug study where we get you, and you guys are about the same age and have similar backgrounds, and we think you're as similar as possible, but we give you a placebo and we give you the drug, and if we see a difference between you two, we assume that it is caused by the drug because we controlled for everything else, right? So that's what we have done here. So for the moment, just focus on these two dots. The blue dot is all the protected land in New England, and the red dot is the unprotected land that is environmentally as similar as possible to the protected land. This keeps me from comparing protected land, which happens to be higher elevation or in some ways systematically biased. I take out that bias, and now I can say, oh good, protected lands have more carbon than unprotected lands. So that's good. But then when we start looking at it by type, so these are the large protected timberlands, which I have a little problem with. They're up in Maine, so I haven't talked about them, but these are working forest lands. And you can see that they actually have less carbon than similar but unprotected land. But who does really well? State lands do well because they either harvest less, and when they do harvest, they use foresters, and they don't just use loggers. But things like easements, they don't see a significant difference in carbon. And so what we've learned here is that particularly with private land, you have the differences between selection effects and treatment effects. And with easements, there's really no selection effect. Land going into easement is just like land that isn't in easement. Unlike wildlands, where when people protect lands at wildlands, it's usually different at the time they protected it. They made it a wildland because it was special, it was different. And so from the perspective of carbon stocks, we can see many of the protection types are not protecting significant carbon stocks. So simply knowing that land protected isn't a lot for carbon stocks, at least in some cases. Forest growth, I'm happy to say that there's very little difference because trees don't know if they're protected or not. Why would they grow any different because somebody has an easement on the land, right? So this always feels good when your stats confirm like common sense. Why then is there a difference with the wildlands? I think it's because there's no harvesting, and the harvesting reduces what perceived sequestration rates on there. But the probability of timber harvest is the other reason I wanted to show this. As you can see, with easement lands, the probability is almost the same that harvest will occur. And in fact, a lot of land is eased so that they can afford to do forestry. Forestry is not very profitable, and an easement will reduce your taxes significantly. And so a lot of the easements out there are logged at least as much as the unlogged land. It's, you know, you really only see big differences in those that have been around a long time, because that's the treatment versus the selection effect. If you do have a treatment effect, trees grow slow. It's going to take a long time for you to see a difference between the two. All this is to say is that knowing that the land is protected is not knowing enough. Knowing how it's protected and what it's protected from is absolutely necessary. And that map that I started with that said, oh good, 25% of our land is protected, had half of the protected land was in the large protected timberland, which comes out worse in every single metric I have. Okay, so land protection, great strides in protecting land from development, but there's more to be done, I believe. But there's a need to better match the protections with the threats and the objectives. So I'm almost done. I just wanted to remind you, this is why we were here, to talk about this 15%. So I just talked about all these different dynamics. What does it add up to? A few bullets. So Massachusetts forests should continue to sequester carbon out through 2050, all of the models and everything we say. But I put should in italics to emphasize these new data that we're finding right now that climate seems to be droughting our forests in ways that we didn't expect. Our forests are about 50% as carbon dense as old growth forests are of similar species, so they should be able to continue growing for quite a long time, but they may not. Things like hurricanes could threaten the carbon sink and the carbon stock. And I want to pause a minute on this because I'm getting no end of flack for quantifying the hurricane risk to our forests. You all probably know about the 38 hurricane, which took down 70%. And it's leading folks in policy, without naming any names, to say like, well, then we can't rely on the forest and it shouldn't be part of the solution. My answer to that is hurricanes are threatening every sector of our economy, and just because we're analyzing it and they're not, doesn't mean we shouldn't. It means they should. What's the carbon consequences of tearing out all the roads on the Cape and you need to rebuild them, or rebuilding all those houses? How much carbon goes into that? It's only to say that there are risks involved and we ought to do our best to understand them. So assuming recent trends in land use, forest sequestration will offset, I kind of hate that term, so I put it in quotes, 5% of 1990 carbon emissions. Remember I said Baker just picked 15. Turns out he was a little optimistic on that. And it also means from the state's perspective, they're either going to have to buy forest carbon credits, I hate that term, from outside of the state. They're going to have to get David Keith to come back with his machine that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. Remember, CO2 concentrations have gone way up, and we all know that, and it's super important, but it's still only 420 parts per million. So just as a matter of doing something, getting it out of the air is freaking hard, right? It's not abundant, and so getting it out is a challenge. So we do still have a problem. How do we squeeze out to get to net zero by our legislative mandate. The forests are not going to get us there unless I'm totally wrong about all this. Possible. And that land use reduces this number by about 20%, which is to say that number could be 6 instead of 5 if we all went away and we didn't have any land use. So half of that land use is timber harvesting, half of that land use is forest loss, and that the sort of the cost of land use is 20% of our sink, that we reduce it by that much. So that's sort of the so what, that's the role for forest. I think it's significant, it's not a panacea, there are risks and there are trade-offs. The last thing I want to say about it is I've just talked to you about forest carbon for an hour now, and I do not think forest carbon is the most important thing about our forests. Unfortunately, they've been reduced to stocks of carbon. I haven't mentioned biodiversity. I haven't mentioned clean air. I haven't mentioned clean water, all the other things forests do. Carbon's really important, and I'm as guilty as the next guy at reducing it to this one dimension, but I hope people will keep me and others in check and remember that it's not just about carbon. That's one of many things that the forests do. So that's all I got. I should say that all the work I showed you comes from a lot of graduate students and postdocs who I listed who aren't coming up there, and they deserve really the credit for all the figures and graphs, and I'm presenting a lot of people's work. Thank you.
John Leibowitz and Bob Purcell talked this afternoon at one's the New England Wildlands, New England Wilderness Trust, and the other's New England Forestry Foundation. And they have this dog and pony show about why saving the land and managing the land with exemplary forestry are both good things to do. A little bit of a comment on, if you would, on whether we can manage, whether we can increase our long-lived wood products in a way that really skew this 40% loss or 60% loss of the wood. The other is, Lincoln's done a lot of really good things with our land uses. The one thing we haven't done is change 2 acres zoning. Can I conclude from your last slide that the actual land conversion rates are such that if we in fact got rid of single-family housing on 1 or 2 or 3 acres zoning, that when we put them all on 10 acres, 10 houses per acre, would we make a difference? Would it be worth fighting for?
Yeah, so I skipped that slide on you, and I'll show you what difference it makes. So since you...
I can't do it.
So this is the current recent trend style development rates at 13.1. This is over the full time period. This isn't annual numbers in case you're trying to make sense of the numbers. Don't just look at them relative. And what I'm showing is the direct emissions, and then this is the foregone sequestration because we cleared the land and the trees didn't grow. This is compact building development that uses sort of best practices. And so, yeah, we can take that number down to 1/3. And I say, if you keep your 2 acres, will you promise me that you're going to fill that lawn with solar panels and not put any in the woods? Was I supposed to talk? Oh, increasing our pickling rate. Yeah, so there's a lot of proposals out there to do things like cross-laminated timber and other mass timber proposals, and we've done a lot of analyses on it. The sort of trouble is that it's all based off of waste wood that we use, and it's sort of, people who worry about it, and I worry about it a little, but not a ton, is that you would incentivize making more waste wood. You know, that you would, if you put a bunch of capital in a mill that makes hemlock cross-laminated timber, you have a real incentive to go harvest hemlock. So yes, you can make it and use a lot more, but there's a lot of economy at play where investments may drive unintended consequences. So the people who are worried about it are worried about it for that reason. It's not my expertise. Tom knows way more about this than I do, and I'm nervous even talking about it in front of him.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was a carpenter for 45, 50 years and worked in the area here almost exclusively with Western timber. In the last 10 years, 15 years, European timber, not much New England timber, if any. Maybe some from Maine. You had mentioned earlier that we could maybe have 2x4s from here.
Yeah, that,
'Cause people say to me all the time, oh, we shouldn't cut the trees. I think, what do you think your house is made out of? It's a cut down tree. So if we could do the cutting here and make the 2x4s here, that'd be really good, but I've never heard of that being possible.
right. 2x4s is probably, I just use this kind of euphemism. That's always going to be a softwood market, right? And where we have strength is in the hardwood market. I think local wood, particularly, you know, I was involved in kind of the controversy around stopping logging on state lands. State lands is where the best forestry we have goes on because they have long-term management plans and they're not making decisions about what to do to pay the tuition payment. They're making long-term decisions, but the state has the ability to shut down logging on state lands, not on private land, so that's where they go. And this is like one of those unintended consequences that we lose our ability to grow wood. This is, as we said, this is a landscape where you stop mowing your lawn, you get trees. It would be a good place to harvest some wood. My frustration in this is, and I'm working on this op-ed, where I think we should harvest more wood, but wood emits carbon. Both of those things can be true. And this argument has been really boiled down to one side or the other. And so it's because if we harvest more wood, we'll use less of European wood, we'll use less of concrete and steel. That doesn't mean it's not going to have emissions and some negative consequences. It will.
I'm not aware of the policies in place, but what are the incentives to save your forest instead of paying for tuition?
Right. So there's a few, and a lot of people are working on it. Like, how do you? So most family forest owners own their land when you ask them, the National Woodland Owner Survey, they own their land first for privacy, then they own it for recreation, and somewhere far down that list is for money. That said, they all always harvest eventually. Usually in the tenure of your land, you get one harvest out of it. And so the question sort of implies, like, how could we offset this sort of one-time fee? So a lot of times what's happening is carbon credits, which is, I love the idea of carbon credits on half of the equation. I want to pay people to manage their forest well and to conserve their carbon. I just don't want to then turn around and sell those to people who want to pollute against them. And that's what a carbon credit is. It just says, here, now you don't need to reduce your emissions because I grew my trees. I wish what we need to do is find ways to incentivize carbon. There's a bunch of existing programs. You can put your land under easement, then you'd pay a lot less taxes. You could maybe sell the easement, though that's getting harder and harder to do. But, and you can put it in current use taxation. There are all these programs, but it's difficult to make a tuition payment on any of them.
So in Massachusetts, are you taxed higher on land that has forest?
No, you're taxed higher. You're taxed on it based on its appraised value. And so when you sell the development rights, the appraised value goes down because now you can't build houses on it, so it's worth less, so you pay less taxes on it. It isn't, you don't get taxed on the trees per se.
Because you do in some states.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on this, but I know in Vermont it's slightly different. So, I mean, different New England states have different policies.
For sure.
So, I mean, Massachusetts, it sounds like you can't, there's like lower tax rates in Vermont if you own land that you have a managed forest plan.
We have that here too.
Okay.
That's what current use taxation is. Chapter 61 it's called, and there's proposals about having Chapter 61C. Originally, Chapter 61 was for, you needed to have a management plan that included some harvesting, and then they had 61B. I'm going to get some of the numbers wrong. If you had a wildlife management plan, you wouldn't have to do harvesting. Now there's a proposal that they would have 61C, which would be, I'm going to manage it for carbon. And then, so what you're doing is just lowering your property tax.
Right.
So
But
You'd have more money in your pocket, but it's not going to be a windfall the way a timber would, or increasingly a solar company that's going to pay rent on your land to the tune of $5,000 an acre per year for 30 years. If you got back 40, that's real money.
So I'm going to nerd out on you a little bit here.
Bring it.
If the state was modeling its emissions into the future and doing it including all sources, wouldn't it include the hurricanes in its baseline? So you'd have the hurricanes in both the baseline and your scenarios, so that they would kind of wash in both those scenarios, and the forestry 15% would still be there?
Yeah, and when our thing ever comes out, you'll see exactly that. That's what we've done. Knowing what the hurricane regime is difficult, and we basically use the past 4 centuries as a guide. Climate change is going to mess with that, and we don't know exactly how, and so we've done our best, but we use the hurricane tracks from the last century, and so 2038 gets the 1938 hurricane, because I got no better guess.
So in effect, that makes the state's 15% kind of real.
Yeah.
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 Other questions?
Any questions online? There's one online too.
Me, is this on? My question is, what about forest fires? We're seeing more forest
All of a sudden
fires.
this year, they're in the news. Normally
New
I
England.
poo-poo this argument, but this
Are
year
we
it's hard
doing
to.
anything to think about forest fire mitigation? A lot of our land is managed to keep everything that falls on the ground tinder ready.
So, in general, our forests are very humid, and as a percent of disturbances affecting forest fires are not a major cause of disturbance. This fall, in particular, it's hard to make that argument because a mile from my house is a 100-acre brush fire right now. Climate may change this, but there are some sandplain environments in Montague and on the Cape and in the southeast that are adapted to fire, and having fire is an important part of their ecosystem. I would not advocate managing any of the other forests for fire. There's about 2 or 3 weeks a year typically where the fire danger is substantial. With leaves on the trees, there's just so much water in those leaves that they're incredibly hard to burn. So it's just this time in the spring and the time in the fall. And so the fire risk is fairly low. Even when you see those big fuel amassed on the ground, it's not that it never happens, clearly it does, but I am infinitely more worried about insects than I am fires. That to me is the wildfires of the East. It feels like every day we have a new invasive insect or pathogen or nematode, as it turns out, coming and affecting our forest and plucking out individual species and having cascading ecological effects that are really hard to understand. All our old growth species, where we're trending towards, hemlock and beech are our most important old growth species, and we're losing them. What does old growth mean without hemlock and beech? I don't really know.
One question from Alan online, also related to fire, is that you mentioned early on that red maple was becoming more predominant. Red maple is fire susceptible, Alan says. Is it because we're suppressing fires that species change? But let me add on to that. If you had an acre in Lincoln and you wanted solely for carbon sequestration, nothing else, not biodiversity or whatever, what would you plant?
And you said carbon sequestration, not stocks, which is actually a different question, because then all I care about is growth rate. I'd probably get some hybrid poplar.
For sequestration. Now, if
Just
you
for
wanted to
sequestration,
storage,
just because it grows
so quickly,
fast, but it dies young,
Yeah.
And so really the only way to win this battle is to grow the trees and pluck them up and put them underwater real fast, roots and all, so that they don't decompose, right? Then you could sort of use the land as a pump, and you could take the carbon out of the atmosphere, put it into trees, and then sink it in the water. To Alan's question, who may or may not be my father-in-law, I don't know, I sent him the link, but that's his name. And he lives on the vineyard where it is a fire-adapted ecosystem, and their fire suppression has changed fuel loads and has changed the potential for intense fires. But that's not a common condition. It's not the condition here in Lincoln. There's just a few places in the state where that's a problem. And by and large, folks are at least talking a lot about it. I actually think fire is introduced into areas that it has no business being because people like managing it so much. But I'm into my opinion now. Forest managers love prescribed fires. It's fun. I did it for a lot of years. Yeah.
All right, Jonathan, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank
I feel like we've been drinking from the fire hose for an hour and a half here, but If anybody wants to watch the talk again, it'll be online, and you can absorb all the details.
Tom, you might want to mention there'll be a slight delay to getting it up online. Jeff's.
Oh, yeah. It will actually take probably a week or 10 days to get it up online because our tech person is going to be absent for a while. You could watch it again, too.